At Monroe, we got you. With a full line of application-engineered products, quick strut assemblies, OE Spectrum shocks and struts, Magnum strut assemblies, OE Spectrum shock and mount assemblies. All engineered with performance, durability, and fitment in mind. We got you with value, quality, and support. Wherever you are, we got you.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Wrench Tales. Today I am with my really good friend from Jacksonville, Florida, Tony Mossuto of Everything Automotive. Hey Tony, how you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing good, buddy. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. You know what? I love having my friends on here, obviously, but I like having people on here that have really interesting stories to tell, especially when something's learned, because that's what it's all about is sharing information and learning. So I want to thank you for taking the time, spending your evening with me. I know how busy you are down there at Everything Automotive, and this time of year, I bet it's nice to be out in the sun in Florida, huh?
Yes, sir. Not
All
quite
right.
hot yet.
So Tony, you and I were in discussion several weeks ago about an interesting case you had with a Jeep. This 2015 Jeep Cherokee. Do me a favor, my friend. Tell me about what happened. Before you gave me a call, what were you faced with? What seemed to be the issue with this vehicle?
It had a high-speed can failure. It would lead the young man where he couldn't shift it in or out of park. You couldn't crank it. It would run great. All of a sudden, it would go open circuit, start flashing, and I had codes and a bunch of modules everywhere, multiple codes and a lot of modules. And honestly, it scared the heck out of me.
You know, Tony, you're not alone in that. I think network failures tend to be some of the most difficult to solve. And here's why. For the most part, many network failures, at least the ones I've encountered, are, I'll use the word intermittent. Not, and when I say intermittent, I don't necessarily mean it only happens once a month. It might only happen once an hour. But the point is, you might have to drive the vehicle to get this fault to occur. The second thing I want to throw in there is technology is awesome. In other words, that picture we see on the screen here, this shifter, you and I know it no longer moves a cable when we grab it and give it a tug. It's just a signal. And that's what allows the shifts to occur. So that's pretty cool, meaning we don't have to exhibit much physical labor to move that shifter. But the downside is it's a computer and it's communicating on a network. So when you said this poor fella had communication problems and couldn't shift and couldn't start the car, those are the nightmares we now face that we never had to face in years past. And I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be for the customer or scary for that matter. Could you imagine being out somewhere late at night and experiencing a communication issue and now the car won't start or shift or anything? So,
No, 16-year-old kid too to add, and I'm a dad of 4 20-something-year-old people. So that was even scarier for me, just thinking about this kid being broke down somewhere.
I feel that, my friend. I'm a father myself, 3 beautiful girls, and the world for them. And I couldn't imagine them scared and stranded. So, with that, I can understand that this fellow wants his vehicle fixed. Now, from your perspective, when you say you encountered multiple DTCs across many different modules, um, before before you and I got into this vehicle together, when we tag teamed this one, Tony, where was your mind going initially? Like before we spoke?
I was scared to death it was going to be the most expensive part on the car because I hate I hate putting my money in something and not being sure. It was overwhelming. There were so many modules, wires, connectors. I didn't know how to figure out, do I have a wire shorting out? Do I have a module problem? Do I have wires, water in the, because you got one sensor all the way in the left rear wheel well. Do I have water, dirt getting in it? I just looked at how big and overwhelming it was, and I really was having a hard time figuring out how to start, other than I was scoping the can lines and trying to unplug and plug things when it was acting up. But it was also very intermittent. It would act up for an hour and then it would act up for 2 days.
And that's the frustrating part. It's one thing to not be familiar with network diagnostics, or maybe it's not even familiarity that's the issue. Maybe it's just a level of discomfort, right? Not wanting to do it. Like you said, when your hands are sweaty and you're nervous and you're afraid of investing money in the wrong component. But to add a intermittent issue to boot, that just makes it 10 times more scary and frustrating, because even if you make a change, you never really know if it fixed the car or the thing's going to come back in a day or two. So I feel your pain there. But you know what? I do like what you did. We came up with a game plan together, didn't we, Tony?
Yes, we did.
We started off with a DTC scan, and I agree with you how you weren't prompted to do this. You did this automatically, and I love that because you realize that these computers are networked together. In other words, almost like on a telephone party line. They all talk to one another on a bus or several buses, several networks. So you began with an all DTC scan. And boy, I'll tell you what, I was overwhelmed when I saw this initially. I thought to myself, holy cow, 14 different nodes or computers on this CAN bus noted some issues with communication. 57 DTCs in total. My Lord, where do you start?
I wasn't sure. I was spinning my wheels, to be honest with you, till you came up with a game. You explained it, how to determine where to start.
Tony, I'm glad you brought that up because I'm sharing with you my experience. At one point in time, not too long ago, I found myself in the same position you are. The problem is I didn't seek out assistance. I did it the stubborn way, and I spent many, many, many hours on this vehicle. And even if I didn't replace the wrong component, right? I didn't make a bad decision. I still wasted so much time and didn't learn much from it at all, other than, what not to do. So I learned many times erasing DTCs after we've stored them, after we've created this health report that you've shared with us right here. Erasing the DTCs and starting with a clean slate to see what comes back. Sometimes that saves us a boatload of trouble and helps us determine which of these faults or DTCs apply to the actual problem we have. In other words, the car won't start or the car won't shift. So, Tony, when I see DTCs, I don't know about you, my friend, but I don't troubleshoot based upon the DTC only. I make note of it and I save it or I write it down and I use it as one puzzle piece for an overall larger puzzle. And I just want to put this puzzle together the best way I can. Tony, you ever watch that show, Wheel of Fortune?
Oh yeah.
And you know how you can solve the problem, you can solve the puzzle right away, or you can keep plugging in letters till you get closer, give you more and more clues to give you confidence about, I'll say, pulling the trigger on what you think the answer is. That's what I think this is to me. It's like I want to turn over as many of those individual letters in a Wheel of Fortune as possible before I commit to saying, it's definitely this problem or it's definitely that problem. So again, I'm using this information you gave me as a piece of the puzzle to help with the diagnosis. That's all I'm really doing. So we've got this health report, and this shows us the individual nodes on network. However, I want to jump back for 1 second because there's something important here. Although this isn't a clear picture, and it certainly wasn't my intention to demonstrate what this is in its entirety. But what we're showing here is network topology. And Tony, have you ever leveraged the actual topology, how it's physically laid out to your advantage?
I try. Yes. I mean, I do try to figure out how they're connected, or if what's in common between different networks.
Agreed, 100%. And what I do is I look at this like a bird of prey flying over several cornfields to seek out a rabbit or a field mouse or something like that. It's next to me. And you'll always notice those birds of prey start way up high in the sky to get an overall 30,000-foot view of the menu below. And it's only when they see something that they desire do they start coming out of the clouds and get more streamlined or focused on what it is they're going to approach before they make their final approach. So I use network topology, like you see here on the screen, to establish how each one of these nodes is laid out in the vehicle. In other words, how they are all interconnected. Now, I will warn you, not just you, anybody watching this, is network topology works great when it is accurate. So in this case, we're talking about an FCA vehicle, a Chrysler, um, a Jeep. The factory tool seems to always have the right topological graph, right? It's laid out appropriately. I will caution you that not all, but some aftermarket tools, although they will attempt to mimic the actual topology for the vehicle you're working on, I've proven time and time again that many of those topological layouts displayed on the aftermarket scan tools are not accurate. So don't lean on this entirely. Be very, very cautious when you look at topology if you're not 100% sure it's correct. But it does serve a purpose and it does provide a huge assistance right from the get go if you have a scan tool that can provide it accurately. So, referencing our health report here, what I like about this is the old way, Tony, I used to go into each node individually. I'd go into the PCM and then I'd get out my piece of scratch paper and I'd start. I'm talking about a big notepad with lines, and I'd start writing down PCM and then all the DTCs. And right after I write the DTC, I write the definition of the DTC and then the next one. And then after I get done with the PCM, I go into the ABS module, for instance, and I'd repeat that process. And heck, there could be 70 to 100 nodes on these vehicles. But again, we capitalize on our scan tools technology. And now we've got health reports, diagnostic reports, if you will, like it shows in the case of this Autel tool you used. It gets all the information on one or several pieces of paper for you. You can save it to a file, you can print it, you can email it and share it with your customer, just like you shared it here with me, Tony. But we use this as, again, another piece of the puzzle to help triangulate the location of the fault. Now, notice I didn't say find the fault because it's very rare, almost never, will I use a single piece of data to find a problem, especially a network fault. So many of these DTCs are fairly generic, or so many problems can cause the same DTC. It's hard to pinpoint an actual fault without multiple pieces of data to help, again, triangulate. Two or three pieces of data point to a single common area. That's what we are looking to do. So after you and I spoke about this, Tony, and we reviewed these DTCs together, we're getting closer rolling up our sleeves and digging into this vehicle. The point I really want to stress in our discussion here, Tony, is that we're not working on the vehicle yet, are we?
Nope.
No. We're taking our time and we're divorcing ourselves from the vehicle to develop and carry out this game plan responsibly. I know it seems counterintuitive, but I think for the most part, many people, including myself at one point in time, thought to myself in a case like this, boy, this job's a bit overwhelming. I better get started right away because the faster I get started, the faster I'll get done taking everything apart to eliminate components. Meaning, the faster I rip off door panels and lift carpets and climb beneath the dashboard and climb under the hood, the faster I'll find the problem. But we didn't do that. I think you played it really, really smart, Tony. And I applaud you for that, for backing up, taking a moment to gather your thoughts, reaching out to me so we can come up with a game plan together. And it was probably an hour or so, maybe not quite an hour, but almost an hour till we actually put our hands on the vehicle, wasn't it?
At least, yeah.
Yeah. So pulling up a wiring diagram along with the DTCs and the health report we had, here's what I determined, or I should say, here's what we determined together. I've highlighted for you all of the components in red that had communication faults, that were complaining of communication faults, and it's shared on the CAN bus. And what we have here is the extreme. I'll say the left side of the screen is where the electronic power steering and the electronic shift module reside. All the way over here on the right side of the screen, or the center of the screen on top, the engine control module and the trans control module reside. Down here on the bottom is the body control module, and all the way over here to the right is the ABS. And every one of these had complaints about the CAN bus. But what we'll notice here is that all of these nodes are interconnected through the CAN bus by way of not one, but two, what Chrysler refers to as star connectors. And this is referring to a star configuration where all the nodes come together at one point. Tony, you've got an example of a star connector right next to you, don't you?
I do. Right here.
What I love about that thing is that it's very accessible typically, and it's very easy to eliminate components one at a time. So these are just things to keep in mind when it comes to star configurations like this. But Tony and I, we need a baseline. We need to understand when a fault is present, because that's not necessarily the time when a DTC is set. So we need something to reflect that the problem is present. This way, when we make a repair or an adjustment or a replacement or some kind of change, that we are going to have something visible to reflect upon to see if that change made a difference in the performance of the system, regardless if it sets DTCs or not. So where do we go from here, Tony? What did you do? What did you capture for me, my friend?
I scoped the CAN bus. We could see what was happening on the network when we had a failure.
That's exactly it. We decided to grab some information regarding the communication network activity itself. This is our data link connector. And we've got our ground terminals that reference battery ground. Here's voltage supply terminal 16. But what I'm trying to show you here is terminal 6 and 14 at the DLC is CAN high and CAN low, respectively. These communicate directly on this vehicle with the rest of the CAN network. What we have to be aware of is nowadays on newer vehicles post 2018, we have the secured gateway to deal with. So what I'm getting at here is if Tony placed his terminal test leads at the DLC, like we're showing right here, and this vehicle did implement a secured gateway, although Tony would see a waveform, it is not the waveform of the CAN bus. This is basically a diagnostic CAN C waveform, something shared only with the secure gateway. So you have to keep that in mind, and you'd have to bypass this gateway in some way, shape, or form to gain access to the bus for monitoring as we are right here. So Tony's taken his test leads and he set up his lab scope to capture the transitioning voltage for CAN high and CAN low simultaneously. Now we're going to use this as a third piece of the puzzle. So we've got the DTCs and a health report. We've got network topology. And now we're going to have data, live data from the circuits that carry the messages from one node to the next. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to resist taking things apart because it's natural for a technician, especially one that resides in the flat rate world, to feel unaccomplished or non-productive unless he or she is disassembling something or addressing something directly. Diagnostics is not about taking things apart. It's about finding the problem preliminarily without taking things apart. So leveraging this scope capture, or series of scope captures with the DTCs and health report and topology, we're going to use this to triangulate a location of the fault. So what we have here in blue, first of all, Tony is using, what scope are you using here, Tony?
Pico.
This is the PicoScope. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, PicoScope is not the only scope out there. All scopes have pluses and minuses, or pros and cons, positive and negative attributes. And understanding how to leverage the tool you own, how to leverage it properly, that scope is going to serve you well. So Pico happens to be, in my opinion, the most widely used scope in the automotive industry. But again, I'll say I've used several scopes and I happen to really enjoy using PicoScope, but it isn't the only scope out there. So if you don't have a PicoScope, don't let that panic you. You might have some limitations with the scope you're using, but follow along and we'll try to explain things as best as possible. So what you see here, although we are only capturing two channels, two pieces of information simultaneously, we are looking at three pieces of data here, and I'll explain them to you. Tony initially sent me this capture, and after scrolling through several pages, I think 33 waveform pages in the buffer, we came across a failure that stood out to us significantly. What we have here in pink is a feature that several scopes have, but in this case, Pico calls it a math channel. A math channel allows us to gain some, I'll describe it as graphing multimeter capabilities. And what this allows us to do, in this case, we've created a math channel that takes channel A in blue and channel B in red and adds them together. And what I'm getting at here is a CAN bus is a differential bus. What it looks at is the difference. The nodes look at the difference in voltage between the two. And a difference of 0 indicates a recessive bus, one that is not currently talking at that moment. And a difference of 2 volts indicates a dominant node, a dominant bit, a piece of information that is being shared. So together, the different combinations, almost like Morse code, of zeros and twos is what the ECUs are looking at to determine communication, the messages being shared. Now, if we were to add the blue channel to the red channel, right, channel A to channel B, we would have a total of 5 volts. What I'm getting at here is CAN high communicates, it's recessive at 2.5 volts and dominant at 3.5 volts. And CAN low is recessive at 2.5 volts and is dominant at 1.5 volts. So at any point in time in this waveform, if you were to add the two together, you'd have a total of 5 volts. The point I'm trying to make here is sometimes staring at these bus messages, again, this is a single message pack in thousands of them that occur every second. To scroll through them one at a time can be difficult to see a fault. But if we configure a math channel like we did here on this PicoScope, all we are looking for is a straight line. A straight line is what we should see. That represents 5 volts in this case at all times, right? Here's 4 volts. Here's 8 volts. 5 volts sits right here. Anytime the capture deviates away from 5 volts, you'll see it indicate a problem like we see right here. So this caught my eye right away. It allowed me to focus on this for analysis to help determine what's wrong with this bus. Now, Tony, after you and I stared at this for a while, we came up with a couple ideas. First of all, we have to consider the possibilities of what could have created this fault. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
That's what we discussed when we were talking on the phone. What's to be noted here, this fault is indicated because CAN high jumped to 4.5 volts at this point, and CAN low jumped to 3.5 volts at this point. And this voltage and the fact that it happened on both of them indicates several things to me. First of all, Tony, let me ask you this. How do we know that the problem, the communication problem we are experiencing with this network is not that any portion of the network is shorted to battery voltage? How do we know that?
Because they didn't go to 12 volts.
For starters, yeah, they didn't go to 12 volts. And even though the fault is present, it's still transitioning high and low. At the same time, how do we know it's not shorted to ground?
Stayed around 8 volts. It never went down.
And if we take the time to consider things like this, what does that mean for us? There are certain things we don't even have to bother testing for because it's all visible right here in the capture. How do we know they're not shorted together, Tony?
Because they would have been the same voltage on both.
They would have been the same voltage on both. And even though both of them were experiencing a problem, one's at 4.5 volts when the other is at 3.5 volts. Tony, how do we know it's not an open circuit?
Because we'd have lost voltage.
Right. If where we were measuring it went open, the computer would have kept repeating the same message like, are you hearing me? Are you hearing me? Are you hearing me? And that's certainly not happening. And if we lost voltage to the point where the circuit went totally open, there'd be no activity there at all for us. That leaves only one possibility, that the fault is internal to one of those 5 or 6 nodes that we showed back earlier on when we looked at the topology. And how do we know that? Because the fault is happening on both. It's offset by a specific voltage, 1 volt. So that eliminates a short to ground, a short to voltage, and a short to each other. And the fact that it comes and goes says it's got to be a node that's intermittently acting up. So the good news is we can visibly see the fault that the car is complaining about, that all the nodes are complaining about. Now it's time to determine which node. And we talked about this earlier. Again, using the information we found earlier to triangulate a location of the fault, if we revisit those DTCs we talked about earlier and actually read through them now, there's some valuable clues considering the new information we discovered. So again, to retrace our steps, we do have a problem on the CAN bus. We saw the problem, and we now realize the problem is internal to one of the nodes. The issue is we don't yet know which of the 20 possibilities it is. So scrolling through the DTCs one at a time, and I read through these DTCs as you sent them to me, Tony, all 57 of them. And one of them caught my eye. One of them set, in this case, the trans control module caught my eye. It set a U1153 double OT. And what that is defined at is trans control module lost communication with the ESM. Now, we already know that to be true because the ESM and the trans controller both talk on CAN bus, CAN C. However, what does it say here? What's the rest of the story in this? What's this mean?
That's a separate CAN network. I think it's direct powertrain. It's the powertrain network.
This is a separate CAN network. The trans controller can talk to the ESM on, let's say, a normally functioning vehicle of this configuration. The trans control module can talk to the ESM or the electronic shift module on the CAN C or high-speed CAN network, as we've been looking at all this time. But it can also talk to the electronic shift module or ESM on the dedicated powertrain CAN bus. Yeah. So this TCM is basically like a gateway. It can talk to the ESM on 2 different bus networks. And the TSM is complaining that it can't talk to the ESM on either high-speed CAN or DPT CAN. So what this means for me, Tony, is now we are focused on only 2 possible failures, the trans control module or the ESM. And again, I'll state, Tony, what did we do to this card? What did we work on so far?
Nothing really.
We haven't touched a single thing. Matter of fact, I'm in New Hampshire and Tony's all the way down in Florida. And Tony runs a very successful, busy shop, Everything Automotive down in Jacksonville. So Tony doesn't have much time to stand around and wait for me. So Tony got to working on other vehicles while I was doing some thinking. And this is the game plan we came up with. So now we're going to be approaching, instead of all 20 potential nodes on that network, we're only focusing on the only 2 that communicate on both CAN C, CAN DPT. So where do we go from here, Tony? What is the system we're going to use, the process of elimination to determine which node is at fault?
We're going to go after the easiest one to get to.
I love that, Tony. You just acknowledged the fact that it's okay for someone like me to be lazy. There's not necessarily a need to take things apart that are difficult to get to. We may have to go there, but why go to the most difficult component first? Start with the easy stuff. I truly have no idea where this electronic shift module is located. I have no idea necessarily where the transmission control module is located because it varies from vehicle to vehicle and from manufacturer to manufacturer. And the logic can be placed in any node the engineers want it to. So we need to go first find out where the trans control module is. And Tony's already alerted me the trans controller is part of the valve body, as it is in many configurations nowadays. So step one is lowering the pan and losing a ton of fluid and making a mess. I'm not sure I want to do that just yet. Second, if we disconnect the trans controller, we might not even be able to start the car or drive the car. So who really knows, right? If that's going to be the best course of action. But we need to eliminate them one at a time to see where the fault is located, to see which one is going to remedy the fault. And it just so happens there's good news for us. Tony, where is that ESM located?
Right in the center console and the shifter module. That's it right there.
So it's basically one entire, I'll call it assembly, a shifter assembly, if you will.
Yes,
And that
sir.
shifter, again, that's just a pretty looking switch, right? We just grab that handle, give it a tug, and close the switch.
Yep, just a little connector, right? Little connector right there. That's it. That's the magic.
I love it. So it's clear as crystal to me that you're going to unplug the ESM. Matter of fact, I think I was on the phone with you and you said, hold on 1 minute, right?
Yep.
And you had that thing apart, lickety split. So the idea is component isolation at that time. And the point I want to make is, fellas, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, we didn't start unplugging things like I used to do before I knew any better, before I had the logic to develop a game plan. We took the time to think and use the information we did have as leverage to triangulate the location of the fault. Using the network waveform, the math channel to show that a fault was present and pinpoint the area we need to focus on, the characteristics of the fault itself located in the waveform that not one, but both can high and can low were elevated about 1 volt, proving they weren't shorted to ground, shorted to each other, or open, or shorted to voltage. It left a node to be the only problem. The DTC told us the node had to pertain to both CAN high or CAN C and CAN DPT. That left us with only 2 nodes. And isolation is going to be performed at the ESM because it's the easiest to get to. And there's the connector there. Everything regarding that shifter is carried out on just a handful of wires here. We've got voltage and ground supply and a couple of network bus circuits. Tony simply disconnected it. And where do we go from here? How would we know if the problem's gone, Tony? Even if you knew nothing about lab scopes, about analyzing the waveform truly in depth, how would we know the problem's gone?
The waveform returns to normal.
Exactly it. The problem's there. Tony's watching the scope as he unplugs the ESM, and the problem goes away. The waveform cleaned right up. CAN high transitions from 2.5 to 3.5 respectively, and CAN low 2.5 to 1.5 volts, just as it should, and they mirror each other. It's that differential that's being seen by the that's being seen by the ECUs and is what determines what the messages are that are being shared. So, like any good diagnostician, taking the time to perform the same tests after the car is fixed that you perform proving the car is broken is in your best interest. The real proof is in the pudding, and that would be performing another DTC scan after disconnecting this ESM and replacing it with a good one. With respect to one, the other 56 DTCs are now gone. Now, Tony, I don't remember
signal
what
bulb. That one
okay,
was just a turn signal bulb. Sorry.
This happened to be a bulb that was out and the circuit was open, and the BCM took note of it and said a DTC. Obviously had nothing to do with our communication fault. So the point is, we've got all the tests we performed that showed the problem was present now show that the problem is fixed. And if you really want to start increasing your fix it right the first time scores, it's taking the time to perform these extra these extra steps like we're doing here, right? Tony fixed the car and the problem starts and the car now starts and shifts just fine. It might seem obvious that the car is fixed, but taking the time to look at the network waveform that shows the problem is there, now shows the problem is gone, along with a DT scan proving 57 DTCs are now clear, really helps solidify the fact that the car is indeed fixed, even before Tony drives it, and more importantly, even before he gives it back to his client. So, Tony, I got to ask you a question, my friend, if you wouldn't mind. I don't want to put you on the spot. Can you give us a little bit of feedback? I remember hearing your voice when you called me. You were kind of shaking in your boots a little bit when we first started talking about this car, but it was almost like talking to a new man after we got done with our conversation.
I just learning how to understand the network and figure out what it could be and what it couldn't be. I really had no idea. I just was going to tackle something until I happened to get lucky and touch the right thing. It's being able to figure out it's not shorted to each other, which I could have. I mean, I could have looked at the thing and figured out if it was shorted to each other, shorted to the ground. But to know it wasn't a wire, to know it was a node instead of chasing all the wires, and then figure. I didn't even really think about there was just so many overwhelming codes to finally realize when you pointed out, hey, there's two different networks on two different modules that are also going down. I just feel so much better because I learned a lot on how to address it, because it's really hard to read the information and fully understand it by yourself, reading the information that the manufacturer puts out on how to approach a CAN bus, and just knowing how it works makes it a lot easier to try to figure out where to go instead of to just keep poking things until you hit the right one.
You know, I truly believe no technician wants to do a bad job. I just don't think they exist.
I agree.
Are there technicians that do a poor job? Yeah, it exists, but I don't think they want to. I think they wish to be better at what they do, or at least more confident at what they do. And with that, implementing testing techniques like this does take some practice, but so does everything else we've learned to do over the years. And there are several really, really good network diagnostic classes out there. And I urge you and everybody else who's not confident in network diagnostics to take the time, invest in yourself, invest in that class, because these networks, they apply to everything we work on since 2008. It's mandatory that CAN bus exists. So get the training you need, and it will really, really help you solve issues, not on one particular make or model, but all of them. And Tony, I love that you took the time to back up and think before you dove headfirst into this car, because you're right, my friend. This could have been a real time consumer. This thing could have ate your lunch. And, even though, Tony, we narrowed it down to 2 out of 20 nodes, how much was that trans control module? Top of your head, what ballpark, what do you think it
I'm
costs?
pretty sure with programming it was close to $2,000,
Holy heck.
because you got
$2,000.
fluid.
Okay, humor me. How much was that electronic shift module?
Well, it didn't have a VIN number, so I used a used one for $100, but a new one would have been $12. Nothing was cheap.
So we're talking over $3,000, and that's after we've eliminated 18 of the 20 potential nodes.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, really taking the time to think things through. The confidence that you had, Tony, that was the best part for me, is how happy you were and how confident you were when you reached for that ECM and you unplugged it and your problems went away. And then you had that donor ECM, ESM, electronic shift module. You plugged it in there. Man, I could hear your voice. You were jumping for joy. But it was, I know you weren't happy that the car was fixed. Oh, let me rephrase that. I know you were happy that the car was fixed, but I could hear it in your voice. You were even more happy that you picked something up that you didn't have before. And you did it yourself, man. You took the time to do the research and look into it and think before you reacted. And I think that That speaks volumes to the kind of technician you are and the type of shop that you run. And I'm proud to be friends with you, my friend.
Thank you very much. That means a lot to me. The learning experience was the most important thing, and putting that kid back in the car, back in the truck, and not having to worry about him being broke down at night, or, his safety was very important to me too.
I love that, man. Thank you very much for what you do. So with that, everybody, like I said, you might not have a PicoScope, but if you don't have a scope, nowadays, I'm hard pressed to say you don't need one. You really do need one, because the way computers have integrated themselves into everything we perform on a car, every task that is accomplished on a vehicle today is in some way, shape, or form computerized. And it takes the speed of a scope most of the time to show us what it is we really need to see to make accurate decisions. We can make lucky guesses all day long. And even if we're right 85 to 90% of the time, we are indeed guessing if we're not 100% sure. So invest in the tools you need. Yeah, scopes are not necessarily cheap. You can find some single channel scopes for just a couple $100, and scopes go as high as $5,000 to $10,000. Do you need something that powerful? No. But I can tell you, if you invest in the tools that you need and those tools apply to every single thing you work on, you will see the return on investment if you take the time to learn to leverage the tools you own and actually use them. In other words, don't pick them up when you're in a jam. Pick them up and use them every single day. Quite frankly, the scope, Tony, if you think about it, didn't this capture the entire story? I mean, between the scope, the scan tool, and service information, we were able to see the entire story play out without taking anything apart. And using these tools and this information, the results of the test we perform, each step basically determines which one to perform next. So we had stepping stones to carry us through the diagnosis with confidence and with virtually no guesswork. Matter of fact, the only thing we guessed at, Tony, was where to start, where we're most likely to find a problem. And that really wasn't a guess. There's no way in heck you're going to drop that trans controller out when that ESM was so easy to get to. But you know what, Tony? If you unplugged the ESM, playing devil's advocate here, and it did not fix the problem, you had even more confidence in the fact that you had to eliminate the trans controller.
Exactly.
Agreed?
Exactly.
So that's what I love about this approach. Tony, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me sharing your story here with everybody on a Wrench Tales episode. Truly, thank you, my friend. It's an honor to have you on the show with us.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and I really learned a lot. That's something that will take me to the end of my career.
Awesome, my friend. Thank you. And listen, you start getting those tough ones, hang on to that information. Maybe we'll get you on for another episode again.
Will do, buddy.
Awesome. Everybody, my really good friend, Tony Mossuto from Everything Automotive in Jacksonville, Florida. If you're in the area, look him up. You will not be disappointed. I'm Brandon Steckler, Tech Editor, Motor Age Magazine, and thanks for joining us on this episode of Wrench Tales. We'll see you next time. Tony, have a great night, my friend.
You too, buddy. Good night.